Good afternoon. This is Amy Milne with the Quilt Alliance. I'm glad you could join us today. Welcome to Textile Talks. I'm the executive director of the Quilt Alliance, and I want to thank you for making time for us. And we have a great program for you today. The title is How One Donation Turned the Berkeley Art Museum into a Quilt Powerhouse, an interview with BAMPFA curator Elaine Yau, conducted by Teresa Duryea Wong. This is going to be spectacular. Really been looking forward to this. If you're joining us for the first time, or you've been here, or you're a devoted Textile Talks fan, you know that Textile Talks is a weekly series presented on Wednesdays at 2 p.m. Eastern Time in partnership with the Quilt Alliance, whom I represent, and our three partner organizations shown here: International Quilt Museum, SAQA, Studio Art Quilt Associates, and Surface Design Association. All of the Textile Talks are recorded, and you can find the playlist available on YouTube. And I'll ask my colleague Lucy Shaken to enter the link for that YouTube playlist in the chat box. You can also find it on all of our websites, and it's a great way to catch talks that you've missed or rewatch. The Quilt Alliance's mission is to document, preserve, and share the stories of all quilts and all quilt makers. And to find out more about the Quilt Alliance and our oral history and quilt documentation projects, visit our website, quiltalliance.org, and consider becoming a member or a donor today. We rely on this kind of community support to carry out our important mission. Everything we do is supported by our members and our donors and our sponsors. And many of you I see in the chat box now, so thank you for supporting the Quilt Alliance. And this is a great time. I have to mention, this is a perfect time to join, because if you join the Quilt Alliance for as little as $30 a month, you'll receive a free registration for our Quilters Take a Moment workshop series. That's coming up this weekend, Friday and Saturday. So you can join today. I'll put all the information about membership in the chat box soon. But please consider that. It's a great deal, and it's a great way to support the Quilt Alliance. And the workshops are wonderful. You can see the presenters listed here. The topics are all about documenting your quilts with video, photography, writing, labeling, and Adonna Richardson, who is a board member, Quilt Alliance board member, as is Teresa Duryea Wong. I see you in the chat box. She's giving one of the workshops as well. So please join us. I want to let you know that if you have a question for our interview participants today, our presenters, please put those questions in the Q&A box. And if you have a question or just a comment, or just want to chat with your fellow attendees, you can do that in the chat box. Or if you have any questions for us, technical questions, otherwise put them in the Q&A, and I'll be sure to bring them up when we get to the Q&A portion of the program. And I want to remind you that after we disconnect the program today, a survey will pop up in your browser, and we would love to have your feedback. So look for that after the program. Want to also be sure that everyone knows that we have enabled Zoom's closed captioning feature. And if you prefer not to view the captions, you can turn them off by finding the CC or live captions. And this is an updated version of what your screen looks like. So it's show captions or CC. And so we have a person doing live captioning. So we take this really seriously, and we hope that if you have any trouble with it, you'll let us know. Okay, well, let's move on to the program, and I'll ask Elaine and Teresa to turn on their video and audio. Welcome. It's so good to see you both.
Hello, Amy. Good to see you.
Hi, Elaine.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Amy.
Yeah, so I want to give just a brief bio for each of you, so that we can also share your contact information here on the slide. So if folks want to jot that down, but we'll also as the interview is progressing, I'll put those in the chat so that you'll have an easy link. But Elaine Yau, PhD, is Associate Curator and Academic Liaison at the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, or BAMPFA, where her work with the African American Quilt Collection has prioritized collaboration with descendant families, contemporary quilt makers, artists, curators, and scholars in order to chart equitable and progressive paths for the quilt's care and interpretation. In addition to co-curating Rosie Lee Tompkins, a retrospective in 2020 with Larry Rinder, she has also published on artists such as Frederick Hammersley, Adeline Kent, Minnie Evans, and Sister Gertrude Morgan. Essays on the latter two artists expand upon the overlapping themes of race, gender, popular expressive practices, and the flexible terms of folk art, issues that were taken up in her critical essay in the Routledge Companion to African American Art History in 2019. Her research has been supported by the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, National Gallery of Art, the American Folklore Society, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Welcome, Elaine.
Thank you so much.
And Teresa Duryea Wong is here to serve as the interviewer. And Teresa, as I mentioned, is on the board of the Quilt Alliance. And I want to tell you a little bit about her background. Teresa Duryea Wong is an author, lecturer, and quilt historian. She is the author of Sewing and Survival, Native American Quilts from 1880 to 2022, and 5 additional books covering Japanese quilts and textiles, American quilts and cotton, and quilts for social justice. She is a contributing writer for Quilt Folk, and Teresa is a member of the International Quilt Museum Advisory Board and the Quilt Alliance Board. She's been recognized as she has been recognized as a scholar by the Texas Quilt Museum. Her lectures are popular with American quilt guilds, and she is invited regularly to lecture at the annual QuiltCon and International Quilt Festival events. She's also a quilt maker and an antique quilt collector, and you can see her contact information and links here. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you both and stop sharing my slides. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you for that introduction. And we're so excited to be here with you guys today. And Elaine, thanks so much for taking your time to visit with us.
Oh, absolutely. I've been a big fan of the Quilt Alliance for a while, and so it's really grateful for this opportunity to speak with you all.
Yeah, the
Thank
Quilt
you.
Alliance is doing great work. Yes. So tell us where you are, Elaine. Literally, I know you're in California, but tell us a little bit about the room that you're in and where you are today.
Yeah, sure. So I am in one of our black box theaters in the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, mostly out of necessity because all of our conference rooms were booked up. But in the end, I think this is kind of an ideal place. It's quiet. I don't know,
The
kind of
audio sounds perfect. Yes, you're in the right
right,
spot.
good sound. But so
Yes.
that's where I am. And it was a little bit of an overcast morning, a little foggy, but I'm sure it'll be really different when I step out of here.
Definitely, yes. So we're here to bring you, I think will be hopefully a really interesting program. I have been wanting to interview Elaine. We planned this textile talk maybe about a year ago, and I had so many burning questions about BAMPFA and this amazing collection. So Elaine has the really great job of being one of the caretakers of this incredible collection of over 3,000 quilts, quilt tops, objects, quilted objects that were bequeathed to the BAMPFA in after 2018 when the avid collector Eli Leon passed away. And we're going to talk a little bit more about Eli. We're going to talk about one of the most famous quilters in his collection, Rosie Lee Tompkins, and just so many really interesting questions for Elaine and how BAMPFA has acquired all these quilts and cares for them. So let's get right to it. Before we dig into the quilts themselves, though, Elaine, tell me a little bit about yourself and how did you end up becoming, so involved with all of these quilts? Something you probably didn't imagine earlier in your career, but tell us a little bit about your background.
Right. Certainly, as I think my introduction sort of suggests, I did not come to quilts through quilt history or through an extensive background in quilting. And in fact, I actually never grew up with quilts. Um, it's just not a part of my own family traditions. And so when people ask me this question, I kind of say through the back door a little bit. A lot of my research interests, in graduate school, in kind of my early museum career, was more kind of conceptual around this category of folk art. Um, I mean, it was a category of objects that I absolutely loved. I think, and I think many people come to it because it's sometimes, the kinds of objects you see, like samplers, duck decoys, paintings, quilts, furniture, were just things that were all about hand making. Um, and there was something so accessible about them that really drew me in. Um, but of course, then, I went to graduate school. And began thinking really critically about that as a category. And so a lot of my studies up until this point have been about moments when modern art history and modernism really became interested in the field of folk art and the ways in which these two areas were in dialogue with each other. Um, and so in a lot of ways, some of the questions were really familiar when I was presented with the opportunity to work with quilts. And of course, since then, I've just been trying to be a really quick study on quilt history, patterns, cultures. Quilting, it's enormous. And I think that's
It
also
is.
why for a while I kind of shied away from it because it almost felt too intimidating. But now I am in it.
I love that. I love your background because I think it gives you a whole different perspective at looking at quilts. So let me share my screen and we're going to talk a little bit. We'll start about talking about BAMPFA, which is, of course, the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive. And hold on one second, I'm going to get this up full screen. So hopefully everyone can see that now. So not everyone is familiar with BAMPFA. Tell us a little bit about this museum and where it is and what people should know about it.
Sure, yeah. So BAMPFA, so we're starting to say it BAMPFA, but BAMPFA kind of lingers too. I know,
BAMPFA, I like that. Yeah.
yeah, the acronym doesn't really roll off the tongue.
Yeah.
But anyway, we are the art museum of the University of California at Berkeley. So we are part of the university and the campus community. We are located downtown in Berkeley. And as the name suggests, we serve the entire campus population. But of course, our collections are quite expansive. And actually, I'll get to that in a minute. The collection itself, kind of the core collection, you could say, kind of goes back to the early 19th century when the university was founded as a land-grant university. But I'd say the incarnation of BAMPFA as it exists today really has its roots in 1963. And that was when the abstract expressionist painter Hans Hofmann made a donation of 50 paintings that really kind of formed the core collection of the museum. Yes, and so yeah, this image here is great. This is the first building that was constructed to house it. And in fact, it was the home for BAMPFA for about 45 years. The building itself opened in 1970 until 2015 when our current building downtown was built. And for a very long time, its focus was really, oriented towards modern and contemporary artists, kind of the best of what contemporary artists were doing. The founding director was Peter Seltz, and he came from New York's Museum of Modern Art. So that hopefully gives you all a sense of kind of the DNA of
Yes,
of the
yes,
museum.
yes.
Um,
And
but
now you're just this amazing quilt powerhouse.
Well,
So,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And I wanted to just give a brief overview of kind of the strengths of our collection because we are a collecting institution as well. So yes, now quilts are a major part, but throughout our history, we have really big strengths in abstract art, conceptual art, avant-garde cinema, especially Bay Area West Coast avant-garde cinema, um, Soviet and Japanese film. Oh, and I forgot to mention, sort of the art component and the film component really came together in the 60s as well. And so I think in a way, we're kind of a unique institution that we both are about both areas, both media or art and
So,
film together.
yeah, so
Yeah.
interesting. All
Mhm.
right, so let's talk about quilts. So this is a photograph of Eli Leon in his home. Eli passed away in 2018, and as we said in the intro, he donated this massive collection of quilts and quilt tops and objects to BAMPFA. He spent 30 some years collecting these quilts and left them in his will, bequeathed them in his will to the Berkeley Art Museum. So let's start by talking a little bit about Eli. Elaine, tell us a little bit about his background and what you guys have learned about him over the years.
Yeah, so Eli was born in 1935 in the Bronx, New York City, was educated at Reed, um, and eventually settled in Oakland. He was a gay man coming of age when it wasn't safe or socially acceptable to sort of live openly as gay. He was trained as a psychotherapist before turning to quilts. I think just for the sake of this audience, his quilt collecting began in the mid 70s, and when he was collecting quite generally, in the realm of quilts, antique quilts, and it wasn't until the early to mid 1980s when he really focused his efforts on African American quilts in particular. I'm sure this will come up later in our interview or maybe in the Q&A. But I think it's also important to say that his quilting was it consumed about the last 3 decades of his life. Um, he was a really brilliant, kind of keen intellect. He organized about 10 exhibitions from his collection. He had book publications. Yeah, on the screen kind of shows, I think, three of his most well-known exhibitions. But at the same time, he was a really complicated figure. I think like most collectors are, and sort of most kind of single-minded individuals are. I know there are some folks in the audience today who knew him personally, who've shared with me that, he could be at once both very warm and sympathetic, but at the same time extremely dogged, single-minded, kind of an infuriating, um, quirky personality as well. Um, Maybe
And
I'll stop
he
there.
loved
Yeah.
showing all these quilts too.
Yeah, that's right. So he lived in North Oakland, and on a kind of occasional semi-regular basis would have yard shows, where he would, um, yeah, as you see here, it would kind of be a neighborhood event. Instead of, watching a movie or a TV show or something, you would just pull up a chair and he would kind of unfurl these quilts. Um, yeah, I mean, I never had the, benefit of attending, but they just kind of looked like really great
And it's
events.
really the value of one of the things that a collector brings to the art world is the value they bring in getting the quilts out there and getting people to see them. So, from museums to even in his home setting like this, it was a big part of his mandate.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think it was, part of what really was also motivating his collecting and his scholarship was a real belief that African American improvisational quilting um, what contained the remnants and the survivals of African textile aesthetics, and any reader of his books will see that that thesis comes through.
And then let's talk a little bit about his home and where all these quilts were stored in the home. And it's kind of a modest home in Oakland. And there were just famously stacks and stacks and stacks of quilts everywhere. So
Yeah,
tell
as you
us a little,
see,
yeah, tell
yeah,
us a little bit about that.
to the rafters, and
Yes.
from a
It's
lot of
not a
the
big home either, right? Yeah.
no, 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 it's not. It's just a very modest bungalow.
Mhm.
At some point, I believe maybe in the early 80s, he actually had an addition built to the back of his home to accommodate more quilts. From some of the accounts I've heard, really only the kitchen was the only space that was not sort of encroached upon by his collection. Um, yeah, and so you can imagine, he really did his best to keep them in really good condition or in sort of somewhat controlled conditions to the best of his ability. But just in terms of, it was also his living space and he owned a cat.
Yeah.
Um, and so, that was something that we also, the museum had to respond to was sort of the general condition of the quilts when they came to us, knowing that they hadn't been in kind of like a very strict climate controlled environment.
Yes. And
But yeah,
here's
please
another
go
one.
ahead.
Yeah, that with
Yeah.
slides that were built, and those shelves that were even built up along the ceilings to hold the quilts.
Hmm.
Pretty amazing. And then, so tell us a little bit about this journey to actually acquire the quilt. So at one point, they left his home, and tell us what happened next and how all of this journey to acquire and process all of these quilts and objects took place.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't sort of immediate. I'd say, Larry Rinder, our former director, often tells the story of when he first got the call from Eli Leon's estate that he had bequeathed his collection to the museum. Um, he recalls the lawyer saying, "First, are you sitting down?" I mean, so it was kind of, the news was totally unexpected from Larry's perspective. And of course, a collection of this scale really is an enormous responsibility. And so there really was a period of time when the university administration really had to think carefully about the resources and its own capacity to take it on. At some point, though, the good news is the decision was made to accept the gift. And then, as part of that process, I know the executor of the estate, Jenny, she had been working closely with a local art consultancy, to do the massive job of inventorying everything. Once that inventory was taken, yeah, and so you can see these are some of the fruits of it. So these are quilts that have been sort of sausage rolled and wrapped in bed sheets, and every little sleeve has Eli's own inventory numbers on it. So in addition to actually physically tagging and cataloging these quilts, there's an extraordinary woman, Stephanie, who transcribed his collecting ledgers. So we actually had some kind of digital record, I
Wow.
should say electronic record to work with, which was really massive, like huge for us at the museum in terms of trying to build a database and get a handle on everything.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I think there's a couple of more slides, Teresa, right? Yeah. Um,
So this is like
so
your temporary art facility before you're, trying to get them all organized to bring into the museum.
precisely. Yeah. And so this is how they were stored for, gosh, I don't know, at least a handful of years until, the museum could get a conservation plan in place. And so currently we are in the middle of year 3 of a 7-year conservation plan to to physically sort of treat the quilts for mold and any risk of infestations. It's a really great firm out in San Francisco. And then they're all sort of treated, vacuum cleaned, repacked, and then they're in a safe condition for us to physically bring them into our collection space. And that's the image you see in the middle. Um, and then each of those gets even further cataloged before they're then stored in our acid-free
Yeah.
storage boxes. Hmm.
I was just thinking, just to try to put things in perspective for people, if anyone is familiar with the International Quilt Museum in Lincoln, Nebraska, the world's largest quilt museum, they have 10,000 objects. It took over 20 some years to acquire those objects. So to get 3,000 in essentially kind of one day, it's just an enormous undertaking, truly. And it's amazing that you guys have made so much progress, and we're so grateful that you decided to take all these in.
Yeah, and maybe if I just can offer another statistic, Teresa, just for audiences. So if you want to click back to the previous image, each
Yep.
one of the I'm sorry, I don't have one. But anyway, we have the quilts in bin boxes.
Uh-huh.
So the quilts that you see here have been folded and stored in 114 bin boxes that are about 16 cubic feet each. And I was trying to find a good comparison for this. That's about 91 standard refrigerators full of quilts
Wow.
and textiles. So there you
That's
go.
a lot. Yeah, 91 refrigerators. I love that. Yeah. So talk a little bit about, you mentioned that when Larry Render learned that the estate was calling and said, "Are you sitting down?" So what did you have to do to prepare? And, tell us a little bit about these quilts that we're looking at here. And, what does it mean to BAMPFA to have all of these quilts in the collection today?
Mm-hmm.
It really changed the face of the museum, right?
Um, it
In a way.
has been. I think it's ongoing. Yeah, so I mentioned the conservation plan. That was really, I think, the most urgent thing for us to address. So not just working with a conservator logistically, trying to figure out how to transfer and pace the treatment of all of them, but of course, fundraising was a really um, a huge concern because, obviously we need to pay for all of this. We were really fortunate that the Henry Luce Foundation was the first kind of philanthropic group to respond to our request and our need. And it was because of their generous funding, we were able to kind of get this process off the ground. It actually paid for my curatorial appointment for the first 3 years. And then consequently, with that footing, we were able to approach other philanthropic groups and donors. And also importantly, the university administration stepped up in a really big way.
That is excellent. And we really
Um,
need those sponsors to help fund all of this too.
yeah, and I think, yeah, there was a second component of your question, which is sort of what the quilts mean for BAMPFA today. I would say it's such an invitation and opportunity for us to think about one, um, this historically overlooked body of work and practices, which is quilt making, which is something that, um, you know, this museum, and I'd say modern art museums on the whole until about like the 1990s or 2000s, hadn't really been thinking about seriously as a really generative and radical art form. Um, I think for us in particular, it's also an opportunity to reflect on that history of aesthetic exclusion and institutional exclusion, to be really transparent about um, even Eli's role and his participation in reproducing some of these inequities. Um, yeah, and I think, and also at its core, just uplifting and celebrating and recognizing the incredible artwork and the heritage that is African American quilt making.
That's excellent. So let's talk a little bit about exactly Eli Leon's collection by the number. So walk us through this.
Yeah. So this was a chart that I had put together. I mean, just even for me to get a handle on things. So according to our database as it stands, there are 3,601 total things that came with the bequest. As you can see, about 90% of them are completed quilts, quilt tops, and other patchwork objects. Um, you can see kind of the numbers on the attributions, and I'll say more. We have a slide that addresses that in more detail, but I think that's also a really unique um, aspect of the collection is that we have names. We have names of quilt makers, which is really extraordinary. As I mentioned earlier, Eli was extremely interested in African textile traditions, and so he did collect African textiles as well. Um, Other quilt-related ephemera and material culture. Yes, Eli's own tie-dye experiments. He was also an artist himself, and I'll just kind of leave that there for now. Um, and another really extraordinary aspect of the collection is the archive that came with it. All of his collecting records, his notes, his slides, audio interviews with quilt makers, drafts of his catalog and his publications. Yeah, it's I don't know. I just feel so fortunate that as a research university, we have not just the quilts, but all of the research that tells the
Absolutely.
story of the collection.
Yeah, it's so rare too for a collector to put so much emphasis on the story. So it's excellent that he had as much data as he could.
Mhm.
Really, really great. So this is a quilt by Rosie, and we're going to get to Rosie in just a second. But first, I wanted to just ask you, tell me a little bit about what it was like for you in your role as a curator, the first time you really felt so, engrossed in these quilts, and you're in the room with them, and coming face to face with Rosie's quilts. Tell us a little bit about how that felt for you as a professional.
Um, I had no idea what I was in for. I'll be very truthful. At the time, I was a curatorial fellow. I just finished, my dissertation. I was with Larry Rinder, Jenny Hirth of the Estate, and art handlers in that quilt storage space. And we were preparing for the show for the 2020 retrospective and literally just hauling these sausage rolls onto the table and unrolling them. I think that there was one image of one of Rosie Lee Tompkins's quilts in storage. I mean, it was literally just kind of seeing a jewel unfold before your eyes. And this one has so much um, gold lame and sparkle to it. It really gives you that effect. Um, and so, and then kind of the thrill of this experience kind of eventually just transitioned to the business of putting an exhibition together, creating checklists, really thinking about which quilts needed special mounting or presentation needs, pedestals, sleeves, Velcro, whatever the case might have been. But it also involved, this is a particular honor of mine, reaching out and connecting with Tompkins's family, her descendants, and working with them, making sure that the account that the museum was putting forth was really honoring to her as an artist.
Yeah, that's wonderful. All right, so tell us a little bit about, so these are all different makers, and you've sort of broken this down into this big pie chart. Walk us through, who were these makers and what
Hmm.
are the objects?
Sure. Gosh, where to begin? So 540 attributed artists. And yeah, and so what I've done on the right side of the pie chart, you'll see certain names called out, and on the right column, you'll see the numbers are the numbers of quilts that represent the works by these women. So as you can see, by far, Rosie Lee Tompkins is nearly 20% of the collection, numbering a little bit over 500 quilts, tops, unfinished works, and fragments. And then the next artist with the highest representation is Laverne Brackens of Fairfield, Texas. R.B. Williams, Angie Tobias, Mabel Battle, Gladys Henry. You'll see on that right column, there are three names: Irene Bankhead, Willia Etta Graham, and Johnny Wade. Um, I have asterisks by them just because these were women that Eli often paid and commissioned and contracted with to complete the quilting of tops made by other women.
Right.
Um, and so it's just, I wasn't able, our database isn't quite set up to sort of sort by, how many quilts did these particular women piece themselves versus ones that they had just quilted. But as you can see, their handiwork is over so many objects in the collection.
Yeah.
Um,
And most of these are 20th century, right? Would that
Yes,
be fair
yes,
to
thank
say?
you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Hmm.
majority 20th century quilts. Primarily because, as Eli became more involved and engaged with collecting from African American quilts, he really started to turn to collecting from living quilt makers themselves. And so,
Yeah. So tell us
um,
a little bit about where some of these are from.
yeah, so this map here, um, I should clarify, is really pinpointing where Eli Leon was collecting. So these are certain cities, as you can see along the freeway,
Yeah.
um, in California that he made intentional collecting trips. So these are where quilts eventually ended up, but that doesn't necessarily reflect where the quilt makers were
Makers are
from.
from.
Exactly. But that said, there was a point in his collecting in '89 when he was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship, rented an RV, drove to the South. And again, these are the home counties where a lot of his California-based quilt makers either were from or um, were born or had family, kind of
So he
the
visited like the parents and
aunts,
sisters of,
grandmothers,
yes, of the quilters
precisely.
in the Bay Area.
Yeah, and a lot
Yeah.
of this is reflective of the second Great Migration patterns really to the West Coast. And so you can see it's kind of concentrated in East Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi.
So interesting. All right. So this is one of the oldest quilts in the collection.
Mhm. Yes. And again, in a lot of cases, we are starting with Eli's own notes, of course, because that's the best information we have. But along the way, as I've been working with, just a shout out to Julie Silber and Adonna Richardson. They've just been such amazing colleagues in helping me date some of the quilts. We've had to, correct some of the things, but this is our current oldest dated quilt.
And
Um,
dating to the 1860s or 1870s.
yes.
Yeah, pretty amazing. And then
Yeah.
this is one of the most recently made ones.
That's right. Yes, dated to 2012. Hmm.
Yeah, very incredible. And this one is from Laverne Bracken's that you mentioned is, you have about 10% of the collection are made
Yeah.
from her. Yeah, in Fairfield, Texas, not too far from me. I'm in Houston. So this one is also one of the ones made by Willia Etta Graham, and she was also has been credited with quilting many of Rosie's quilts.
Yes. Hmm.
And we're going to talk more about her in a minute. And here's one also from the 1920s. And this was taken, tell us a little bit about this. It's taken before it's come into the museum, right? Before your conservation process.
Yes, that's right. And that also will explain sort of the informality. There are no gloves on our art handlers. Um, but yeah, this was kind of an intermediary step from getting the quilts out of the rolls into those bin boxes. And this was done yeah, in 2021 during the pandemic. So that's why we're outside.
Yeah,
Um, just set up tents and tables. Yeah.
beautiful quilt. And another one by Lucinda Ballinger from circa 1900.
Yeah, and this one is really wonderful. This is actually Willia Etta Graham's grandmother's quilt.
Oh,
And yeah, and so this is one that she sold to Eli, but that was she had kept in the family.
really,
Yeah.
really beautiful. All right, so let's get to Rosie. Definitely Rosie is one of the most celebrated quilt makers of the 20th century. She was had an incredible vision and was truly kind of went her own way in her quilts. Not only were they improvisational, but they were also, she made a lot of collage quilts, and she just had a really extraordinary aesthetic. She was born in Gould, Arkansas in 1936 and eventually made her way to the Bay Area. And she changed her name, which Elaine will talk about here in just a minute and try to explain that. But she met Eli Leon in 1985, and it really changed the trajectory of both of their lives after that. And it's really hard to tell Rosie's story without telling Eli's story. The two are very intertwined because Eli had such an important role in bringing her quilts out into the public and into the museum settings and into fine art shows. So let's talk a little bit about Rosie now. Elaine, tell us about her aesthetic and her quilt making process and a little bit more making her more familiar to people that are not familiar with her and her work.
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to try, I would like to at least start part of her story without Eli, because she clearly had a really rich life before he entered the picture. And I think excuse me, her quilting practice really like predated his interest and all of his promotion. But yes, as you said, she was born in 1936 in the segregated South, to a sharecropping family. Her mother was a quilt maker. She had aunts that were also quilt makers. And the BAMPFA does have one example of her mother's quilt where you can see it is, from what I can tell, from what remains of it, looks a bit like a postage stamp quilt in the sense
Mm.
describe the size of the pieces, but it is improvisationally pieced. I mean, growing up, she was one of, if I recall, almost 15 other siblings. And so, this notion of quilting out of necessity and really quilting functional quilts was a part of her heritage and a part of her background. Um, but yes, she comes to California in 1958, works as a practical nurse, um, is married, raises a family, was a Girl Scout leader. She really had this life and began quilting. I think, yeah, began quilting um, crazy quilts and pillows. I think we have an image of one of her business cards from those years. So she clearly, had taken quilting and was, had her own kind of business with it. Um, and I think it's interesting that she puts crazy quilts specifically, because I think it also maybe kind of speaks to some of like the improvisational strain that she really kind of carries forward in the works that we know today. But yes, now about her aesthetic, she was an extraordinarily spiritual and woman of faith. Um, she was a member of a Seventh-day Adventist church in Richmond, California. Richmond is a town just a few miles north of here, but where she lived. And you'll see the amazing use of color in a lot of her quilts as well. A lot of her color choices had to do with spiritual symbolism. That one image, sorry for you to go back, the one image of her
Mhm.
standing with the quilt on the fence.
Uh-huh.
That quilt in particular, Eli has a few notes of different scriptures that are connected to the different colors. But you can sort of, I think a lot about this phrase. Okay, sorry, I need to get into my notes here. Her body of work, and I'm going to quote Horace Ballard, he was a contributor to the retrospective catalog, the work of a restless mind and capable hands. And I think a lot of that had to do with how she understood quilt making both as a meditative practice, as a site for prayer and meeting with her ancestors and family members that had since passed on. There are a few quilts that are kind of her, what I kind of think of as her late work, which tend to be smaller wall hangings with yo-yo pieces, but with a lot of heavy embroidery where you see, I think her own name, sorry to jump ahead, her
That's
own
okay.
name embroidered on there, dedications to family members.
Yes.
Um, Yeah. Just to speak to some of the velvet pieces, of course, this is kind of a signature aesthetic for her. She really, you really see this amazing use of luxury materials, but of course,
Yes.
ones that materials that she would thrift, purchase.
She used all kinds of things,
Yeah.
towels and printed
Mhm.
textiles, but velvet is something that she came back to often, right?
Exactly. Yes, as you can see here, some of her most iconic pieces, I think both for, like the tactility of velvet, the way it's so lustrous that it like absorbs light, reflects light at the same time. So they really do have this jewel-like quality to them.
Yeah.
I think there was that earlier work that we had shown with there was lame and a lot of kind of like lurex and gold threads throughout. Yeah, this is a really wonderful tied quilt, which I love too because you can see with the border on this one, she actually backed and tied this quilt herself.
So interesting. Now, we were looking there at a photo of the 2020 exhibition, but she was also part of the Whitney Museum of American Art Biennial in 2002. And this is a big, big deal in the fine art world. Could you just
Mhm.
talk a little bit about this particular, three of her quilts were shown in this particular exhibition.
Yes, and again, I think in this case, Larry Rinder again is sort of that crucial link in this.
He was the
Um,
curator for this year, correct?
Ex-
Yeah.
Yes, for this particular year, yeah. And he had actually curated a one-person show at BAMPFA in 1997 as part of our Matrix series, which really focuses on emerging and contemporary artists. And so I think it's really a credit to sort of even his recognition of how extraordinary her aesthetic and her talent was as an artist. But yeah, so this is an example of I think this is the first instance of her quilts being shown in New York City, especially in a fine art context. I thought it was really interesting for me to put the pieces together, but just later that fall in 2020, after the Whitney Biennial, is when the Quilts of Gee's Bend exhibition opens at the Whitney. So there's sort of this amazing kind of like back-to-back moment um, in 2002 where quilts are sort of getting this attention in a fine art setting.
Yes. It was a long time coming.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the quilting process of Rosie's quilts. As you mentioned, a lot of them were only tops that she made, and many of the quilts were finished by quilters that Eli hired.
Mhm.
And this is something I think needs a lot more study and is a really interesting area of quilting as an art form. Talk a little bit about your thoughts of these quilts being finished by someone at a later point.
Yeah. So maybe I'll start that question, my answer by saying I think um, as a responsible curator and also an art historian, it is crucial to know which individual is responsible for what part of a finished artwork. And this would be for any artwork. So if
Yeah,
we're thinking of sculpture, we want to know like what foundry, was casting a particular sculpture. So in the case of quilts, I feel very similarly. So it's important to know that Rosie Lee Tompkins was the piecer of this quilt. It's important to know that, yeah, either Irene Bankhead, Willia Etta Graham, or another individual quilted it and finished it. And this is something that we capture in our cataloging.
yes.
And
And they
that I
didn't
would,
necessarily interact with Rosie. They were kind of
yes.
working alone.
Exactly. And I think that's also a crucial thing. Yeah. And this is something, it's such a great question because I was just talking about it with our registrar about how to capture this information. So we have so many examples in Eli's collection where often it is the completion of a quilt is truly a collaboration where you may
Mhm.
have two women, a mother and a daughter, working together at the same time to finish a quilt.
Yeah,
Um,
yes.
but
And that,
then, but yes, in this case, how do we communicate to an audience or to a visitor that the two women weren't necessarily interacting or
not
engaged, as
collaborating,
was the case
correct.
with Tompkins? And so I think that's where, the label and essay really has to fill in that crucial context.
Yeah. I want to fast forward to this particular image here because I think
Yeah.
it's like as a quilt maker and a studier, appreciator of quilts, it's like, ah. So these are remnants of the quilts because many of her quilts did not lay flat. So the
Mhm.
quilter would take them apart, So tell us what we're looking at here.
Yeah, so this is probably one of the best examples of kind of illustrating the implications of how we talk and think about these kind of the distributed labor of quilting.
Yeah,
So that marvelous string quilt, velvet string quilt that was in one of the early installation shots, what you're seeing are the remnants of Willia Etta Graham's um, work of quilting it. So actually, if you go to the previous slide, Teresa, if you
yes,
would.
yes.
So your viewers might be able to see instances where you can see the strings, but some of them there's a seam and things don't quite line up. So those are instances where Graham has actually physically like folded over parts of the top and sewn it flat. Otherwise, it would kind of bulge in a way. And then in other instances, as you saw in that other image, where she just had to cut wholesale, like whole cloth, like areas of the top, in order to make it flat in the way that we think of a finished quilt. And so in this case, kind of Graham's intervention, I would say, really did, change the way we see it. I think a lot of those arcs, um, she kind of did additional restructuring in a major way.
Yes.
Um, of course, her name would appear on the label regardless, but that I hope that just gives everybody kind of a sense of
It's just a
how
fascinating twist. Yeah.
exactly how things really can change with when another person gets involved.
Yeah, yeah. All right, so let's talk about where everyone's excited about this exhibition. So tell us about where people can see these quilts.
Yeah, so the next big opportunity, please mark your calendars, is an upcoming exhibition opening June 7th, so next summer. Um, called Rooted West. The entire title is on there, 20th Century African American Quilts in California. And this is kind of the group show sequel to the Rosie Lee Tompkins retrospective. It will feature about 100 objects representing roughly 90 individuals. But as the title suggests, it really uses the historical moment of the Second Great Migration to tell another part of the story of these quilts. So themes such as quilts in movement, quilts as vessels for memory, and their ability to maintain kinship ties within African American families are kind of core concepts to the exhibition, but sort of as is this kind of post-war flourishing of quilt making. And again, this was really my an attempt to put the frame back on the quilt makers and their stories, um, and to
So
really say
interesting.
that.
Yeah, yeah. And this is, this kind of gets at the heart of what you have been studying as
Yeah.
in all of your work. So talk to us a little bit about the sterile museum setting versus the real setting where quilting is made and where it all happens.
Sure. Yeah. And this is kind of this image helps me remind myself kind of what the work of the museum is trying to do is really kind of um, yeah, I feel like I kind of want to exist where that vertical line is. Yeah, the galleries really are such a controlled environment for seeing quilts. And of course, it's great for giving visitors like a really clear view and space to really contemplate the histories. But I think I just kind of, as I've been working with the collection, it's been so clear that the life of these objects and the life of their makers happens outside of the museum walls. That's a much longer story. But the images on the right really, I think, just show just truly the variety of ways that a quilt lives in the world. Um,
Yeah,
either like with their maker displayed in really ways in ways that are really different from an art museum, in communities, in relationships with other people. Um, and so part of, yeah, the show and the catalog, there is a catalog, um, really tries to call forth the life of quilts before they arrive at the museum. And of course, it also very critically tries to address how quilts change once they're in a museum.
fantastic. And so some of the quilts are online where you can go, and this is the links to where we can find them.
Mhm.
And so I want to stop it there, and all of this will be, we can put this in the notes. And I just wanted to thank you so much for taking your time and sharing all your expertise with us. And I wanted to just leave a few minutes for questions. Amy, we'll turn it back over to you. I'm sure there's quite a few questions, it looks like, that came in.
Yes, so many. In fact, if you see one that you want to pull out in particular, but I want to be just take one moment to ask my own question, and I'm curious about because this is this collection is in the University of California at Berkeley. What have you had any interaction with the students yet and the collection? Have you thought about how it will be used as a teaching tool? I would love to see a room full of college students interacting with this museum. I mean, with
Mhm.
this exhibit.
Yeah, absolutely. So my role at the museum is also academic liaison, so I think about this question a lot. It is my dream, yeah, to have faculty who would design classes or have their students really engage with the quilts as part of, yeah, their undergraduate and graduate educations here. I will say, as you can imagine, just the effort at mounting the show, doing this first pass at research, reaching out to descendant families is a huge is a huge lift. We are a mid-sized museum with kind of limited resources in that way. So a lot of the effort is you know, being put forth to the exhibition. But I do want to sort of emphasize also for the audience here is that, I am the curator at the museum in name, but really so many individuals and organizations have been also putting their minds and resources to helping us think through the collection. And really, when I think about these quilts as cultural belongings to Black history, to African American culture, other custodians of Black history, um, I really do think of it as a shared custodianship. And so that's why I've been so grateful to work with Adana's organization, the African American Quilt Documentation Study Group, the African American Quilt Guild of Oakland. I really hope that, yeah, any partnerships with other faculty will just continue to deepen the work and the preservation and the awareness of these histories that the quilts have.
That's so good to hear.
One
And so,
question we got, Elaine, was about whether the quilts are hand pieced or machine pieced.
It's a range. Yeah. I don't have numbers at the top of, at my fingertips.
But you did
Um,
both, yeah.
yeah, but Tompkins, yeah, for example, she did both, as many of the other quilt makers did
Yes.
both.
someone asked about labels, and another person asked about if are any of the unattributed quilts, is that the end point, or do you continue searching for who made that quilt and continue the research?
Oh, that's a really great question. So one way I've been thinking about the unattributed quilts is, and you'll see this in the catalog, is using the phrase maker once known or
Yes,
slash unidentified artist. And I think it's just a really simple way of acknowledging that the, the maker was probably once known by either, of course, foremost to themselves, to those who were closest to them. But it's really acknowledging just sort of a lost story or like kind of a lost thread
yes.
we're faced with in the present. As for further research, yeah, I can't say I have, formally followed up. Sometimes we have a name, so we have names, we have attributions. To the extent possible, I try to, do my genealogical research. Ancestry has become a really good friend of mine, ancestry.com. Um, and ultimately, I would love to do that kind of work. I'm fortunate that in some cases, Eli actually did that work and we have his documentation. So I'll often just rely on that. But of course, in instances where things might be more tenuous, you just have like possibly so and so, and you kind of, you know,
Right.
suggest that in the label.
Fantastic. I think can go over a little bit if there was another question that you saw, Teresa, that you wanted to ask, or if there were any final thoughts that you wanted to share, either of you.
Let's see. Are you taking more textiles now? Someone is asking.
Yeah. Um, Not actively at the moment. As you can
Yeah,
imagine, we
it's a
sort of are,
lot.
we're really hoping that, we need to just kind of figure out a plan for this current bequest and this collection. And we're really hoping that the exhibition will sort of kind of kickstart that conversation
Yeah.
in the public among other institutions as well.
So there were quite a few questions about, we skipped over 2 or 3 of her quilts. But tell us, you did do a book in 2020. I know that book is hard to find, and you're working on a new book. So just tell us where people can go to see Rosie's quilts.
Oh yeah. So if you're in the Bay Area, we do have one of her quilts on view right now as part of our collection show. It is only one of, it's a group show. I would point people to our online collections database. I think that was on one of the previous slides. So all of the quilts that were in the retrospective, you can find digital images there. And I understand that the catalog is something, I don't know if it's out of print right now, but we do have copies that you can buy through the museum shop.
Awesome. And you're
Um,
working on a new catalog for the new
that's
exhibition.
right.
Yeah,
Exactly. So that
yes.
should be available next summer.
This has been fantastic. I'm so excited that you were able to share all this with us, Elaine. And I know, like me, there's just so many people so curious about this amazing donation and seeing all of these quilts, not just by Rosie, but the other quilters as well. Incredible collection.
Uh, Thank you for a
Absolutely.
great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you both, and we'll look forward to seeing the show. Let's all meet up, everybody. Let's all meet up at the show.
Off to
Thanks,
California.
everyone. Yes. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you next week. We're going to show our support for our sponsors next, but have a lovely day, and we'll see you next week.
Awesome.